I'm Barbara Wall, the Vice President for Mission and Ministry. I'm very grateful that you took time this afternoon, late in the afternoon, to be with us. I'm especially grateful also that all of our deans in each college came on board and supported this wholesomely, as well as so many departments and offices, programs throughout the college, throughout the university. So this is an important issue for many of us. I would also just like to begin with expressing particularly my gratitude to Jason Steinhauer of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. He's here. Where are you, Jason? Great. Who provided the title for this panel discussion, Discord in America, Lessons from Charlottesville. I would like to also take a few minutes before we begin the panel discussion to provide some context from Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis and his predecessors have called for a church that is about building a society that calls for the continuous recommitment of what we pray in the Our Father. Thy kingdom come. At our baptism, we're called to be co-creators of God's justice and peace in the world. Cardinal Turkson, who was here a few years ago and spent some time in a class on American Catholicism, said to the students, you know, if you don't think that your faith has anything to do with the kind of work you do, where you work, and what you achieve in the work that you do in your lifetime, then maybe you need to think seriously about no longer saying the Our Father. I was like, whoa. And he repeated that. Because of this phrase, thy kingdom come. If you're not willing to do that, then maybe you need to stop praying that or asking that or claiming that. Pope Francis certainly has called for us to look at the world and particularly those who live on the margins. He has called also for a renewed commitment to peace building and the elimination of all forms of racism and discrimination. Archbishop Chaput of Philadelphia spoke of the events that took place in Charlottesville on August 12th. He stated, racism is a poison of the soul. It's ugly, original sin of our country, an illness that has never fully healed. Blending it with the Nazi salute, the relic of a regime that murdered millions, compounds the obscenity. Thus, the wave of public anger about white nationalist events in Charlottesville this weekend is warranted. We especially need to pray for those injured in the violence, but we need more than pious public statements. If our anger today is just another mental virus displaced tomorrow by the next distraction of outrage we find in the media, nothing will change. Charlottesville matters. Archbishop Gregory of Atlanta also stated, and by the way, this week, a pamphlet that comes out from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops entitled Origins had statements from so many of the cardinals and bishops throughout the United States condemning what happened in Charlottesville. But I'm just selecting a few. Archbishop Gregory stated, hatred and vile, racist actions defile the United States of America. Such activity is never justified. Those who plan these acts must be denounced and defied. Cardinal O'Malley of Boston has stated, the angry and violent mob which gathered in Virginia this past weekend by word and deed contradicted our national creed and code of civil conduct. As a nation in the past century, we led the struggle against the pagan ideas of Nazism. Those who seek to resurrect a new form of Nazism and extreme nationalism, those who denigrate African Americans, who preach and practice anti-Semitism, who disparage Muslims, those who threaten and seem to banish immigrants in our land, all these voices dishonor the basic convictions of the American political and constitutional traditions. They must be opposed in word and deed. As a Catholic bishop, he continues, I welcome the opportunity to stand with other religious leaders in the land in opposition to the voices of fragmentation and hatred. As the Archbishop of Boston, it is my responsibility to call the Catholic community which I serve to remember the basic truths of faith and reason, which are so central at this moment. The truth that our rights and our duties to each other derive from God. The truth that we can successfully oppose hatred and bigotry by civility and charity. Archbishop Chaput's insistence that we need more than pious public statements is essential. There are many resources today on our campus and so many of our websites that can be especially helpful if people wish to pursue a further understanding, especially if you wanted to check out the Mission and Ministry website. We are here this evening to learn from what happened in Charlottesville. What is the meaning of free speech guaranteed by the First Amendment, and is this guarantee absolute, or are there limits determined by the common good? How are we socialized today by means of social media? How do we respond to hate speech? How have our opinions been socially and culturally constructed? And lastly, maybe we need to refresh our historical memory with regard to understanding the rise of Nazism and today's neo-Nazi movements. The panel will now begin, and each panelist will provide a presentation of not more than 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to question and answer session. I ask you please to silence your cell phones at this time, and again, thank you for being here. I'll introduce our panel next. I know you're ready, but I'm going to tell them a little bit about you.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm waiting. Back to the glow of it.
Dean Mark Alexander is the Arthur J. Kania Dean and Professor of Law at Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. His research focuses on the constitutional dimensions of election law and campaign reform, and he has authored several books on the First Amendment and constitutional law. He previously served as Associate Dean for Academics and Professor of Law at Seton Hall University School of Law. Dean Alexander is a sought-after speaker and panelist for national and international law symposiums and academic forums. His international experience is significant, having spent a year in Spain teaching American law and politics on a Fulbright scholarship. He is also a fellow of the U.S.-Japan Leadership Program, and Dean Alexander served on the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board from 2010 to 2014, a position appointed by the President of the United States. Beyond academia, Dean Alexander has served as an advisor and issues director for several high-profile political campaigns. He clerked for Chief Judge Felton Henderson of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California and was a litigator with Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. Dean Alexander earned a Juris Doctor from Yale University Law School and a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Yale University. He also plays tennis. That's why his arm is bent. I'm going to introduce all three of them, okay, and then we can just move on. Professor Billy Murray is from the Department of Communication. Dr. Murray joined the faculty of Villanova University in 2010 after completing her doctorate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Originally from South Carolina, you'll detect that in her accent, Dr. Murray earned her BA, summa cum laude, in Communication Studies and Political Science from the College of Charleston, and her MA in Communication from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She is currently an associate professor and assistant chair in the Department of Communication and faculty in residence with the Center for Peace and Justice Education. Dr. Murray's research seeks to advance understanding about the relationships between public space and the rhetoric of social protest. Her activist work has focused on human rights and peace organizations and the Occupy movement. Dr. Murray's work has appeared in Argumentation and Advocacy, First Amendment Studies, Western Journal of Communication, and Communication Theory. Her most recent research project explores public responses to hate speech and issues of allyship in activist communities as she participates with other activists and in counter-protests against white supremacists in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Georgia. She is currently working on a book-length project detailing this work. As a rhetorical activist scholar, Dr. Murray believes that her research should contribute to social justice and the public good. She strives to continue learning from and contributing to the people who work to make our communities more peaceful and just. You can see why we recruited her for the Center for Peace and Justice Education. Dr. Paul Stiege of the Department of History is Associate Professor of History and Faculty Director of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. He received his PhD in Modern European History from the University of Chicago. His book, Black Market, Cold War, Everyday Life in Berlin, 1946 to 1949, was published by Cambridge University Press. His current book project explores violence in everyday life in 20th century Berlin. I am especially grateful for these three people who so graciously and immediately responded to my request to participate in this panel. And I know this afternoon we will all be grateful for their insights, their knowledge, and their life work. So let's give them each a warm applause. Thank you. Yes, please.
So thank you, certainly, Barbara, for organizing this. I was quite pleased, and I'm sure that I can probably speak on behalf of Billy and Paul here, to get your call, to know that we'd have a chance to have this conversation today. So I'm very pleased to be here, so thank you, and certainly I'm glad to be able to have this conversation with such a great group of colleagues. I'm here to talk about something which we're all experiencing across the country, but particularly with our community. I'm happy to be able to speak with our Villanova community about these pressing current events. I am certainly the dean, but also, as Barbara mentioned, I am a scholar of the Constitution and the First Amendment in particular. So I want to talk about the First Amendment a little bit. And while that is a field of mine, I also want to talk about a field which is not mine in terms of my scholarship, but I feel compelled to address as well, and that is certainly St. Augustine. I want to talk about what I see as a connection, an important connection, between our country's First Amendment and commitment to free expression on the one hand, and our university's commitment to Augustinian values and our Augustinian heritage, which is, of course, often expressed in the three words veritas, unitas, and caritas. So while I am not going to claim to be a scholar of Augustine, and I'm sure that the Augustinians in the room may forgive me or correct me, I see some great connections which I think will be worth speaking about during these few minutes I speak. So I want to start with a little bit of sort of a broad philosophical frame about the First Amendment to set up the conversation. And the basic question is, why do we provide in the U.S. Constitution for a protection of speech or expressive activity? There are lots of theories, lots of possible answers, and I want to mention two broad philosophical frames to start. First is a concept of the pursuit of truth and the marketplace of ideas. The First Amendment is often seen as essential to the pursuit of truth in a marketplace of ideas, and the government is not allowed to interfere in that market. So good ideas may rise or fall on their merits. So an example I like to use is if I want to argue to you today that the earth is flat, I can. I believe it to be true. I'm convinced, and I approach you and I say, hey, the earth is flat. Look out on the horizon and it looks kind of flat. Right? And you know that, right? You've all looked out and you see that it's flat. So that's what I've seen, so I believe the earth is flat. So you think about it, and you think, gosh, he makes some sense. And then you start to believe me for just a second there. And then a friend comes up and she says, I was in an airplane the other day, and up from the airplane I could see something look like just a little bit of a curve. I didn't see it flat. And she says, the earth is round. And you say, oh, well, geez, Alexander said it's flat, and you're saying it's round. Do you have No, I don't have pictures from that airplane, but I saw it. So you start to be torn. Then imagine you run to somebody, an older gentleman who maybe 50 years ago took a trip up to the moon. And he says, I was up in the moon, I looked down, and I saw this big blue marble that in fact was Earth, and it was round. I actually have some pictures, and I want to show you the pictures. So in the end, you realize that perhaps I'm a little bit off, and in fact, the Earth is round, but I get to say it. I get to say that it's flat, and you get to hear competing perspectives. And by allowing all of us to speak, uninhibited in our speech, the marketplace of ideas sorted out this little debate, right? You found what you believe to be true, that is, the Earth is in fact round. And the First Amendment then ensures that we can have this kind of debate. So that first concept is thinking about how we have a marketplace of ideas. So a second concept, which is certainly related to the first, about how the First Amendment, what it's about, and that's about our own self-government and about robust public debate on key issues. So in that context, the First Amendment is central to our nation's commitment to self-governance and a robust debate on topics of the day. We are committed to a system of government by which we all are allowed and I think expected to participate in governance. We threw away the mantle of a monarchy in exchange for a government of the people, and so in that context we all need to participate. And every day we are allowed to debate the policies of the government, good or bad or indifferent. Because what we know is that every day the president, and currently Donald Trump, he wakes up every morning, there's somebody outside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue who says, impeach Trump, or Trump is the worst. And what he also knows is that before that, Barack Obama used to wake up every day and somebody said, impeach Obama, Obama's the worst. And before that, it happened to George W. Bush, and before that, Clinton, and so on and so forth, because we allow for this to happen. The First Amendment protects the right of the people to speak out in favor or against their government, and does not allow the government officials to get in the way of our own self-governance. And that's sort of the risk we run. We run that risk that our government officials need to stand up and be heard and have other people who can stand up and be heard against them. And so in that context, that debate, which is similar to that first marketplace of ideas idea, that also connects in with how we run our country. We allow for a free, unfettered discussion so that we can grow as a country. Now, sometimes we find that when we're engaged in this conversation, words can hurt and it can cause great pain. So specific First Amendment doctrine, which I will not give you a 2-hour lecture on, but maybe another 2 minutes, deals with what happens when you get up to the line where things happen as a result of words. We all know, we're at an academic institution, we all know the words are powerful, but sometimes words have the power to actually cause particular harm, and it can come the harm of violence, fighting, and so we deal with things that are incitement, fighting words that may have a detrimental effect on our society. You know, the famous expression, the concept is out there that you can't shout fire in a crowded movie house. That was something which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote about back in 1919, which was a big turning point in First Amendment doctrinal history. What's important is that you can shout fire in a crowded movie house if it is on fire, because that's doing a service. But if it isn't, then that's when a harm may ensue. If people believe there is that fire, they run out and they stampede each other, then that is a harm which we want to protect. So the court over the years has talked about ways in which we get to the line where then some sort of a violent or painful occurrence will follow the words. Right? So when you have somebody who may then incite some sort of violence, whether it's gathering your own people against somebody or whether provoking somebody else against you, when you get up to the point, the court talks about terms like imminent violence, true threats, and things like that. When we get up to those points, the court says speech is not always protected. And so the point is that free speech is essential to our civil society. We must, not should, but must, we must protect free expression in order to promote a robust public debate that is at the core of our form of self-governance. But when the words go beyond expressing ideas to the point of causing harm, they then lose protection. Now, determining that line is far easier said than done. And that's, I think, where we find ourselves today. So, with that very brief conversation about the First Amendment, let me think about our university's commitment. The First Amendment to me is our national commitment as a people, as a government, but what about our university's commitment to free expression? And I believe it can be traced to St. Augustine, who had a dynamic vision of people living in community, united in mind and in heart, in the search of wisdom. You know, for Augustine, the wisdom is divine truth, revealed in Jesus Christ, for which that wisdom, each heart is restless. That's where Augustine starts us in our university's conversation. Right? From the inception, the order of St. Augustine, the forefathers of our home, centuries before Villanova University existed, the Augustinians were always motivated by Augustine's vision that, quote, God would like to sow in every soul the seeds of intelligence and wisdom. That's our restless heart, in search of intelligence and wisdom. So I see a shared commitment in our religious roots here and our secular roots as a nation. As a Catholic Augustinian school with a mission, and as a country with its own mission guided by a constitution, we are committed to freedom to speak, limits on how we speak, and a commitment to a pursuit of truth through examination and engagement. So I see the Constitution and the university coming together in moments like these. While the Constitution does not permit us to say certain things that may cause harm, our university tradition, I believe, requires more than just not causing a riot. I believe we must speak from the heart. I believe, in fact, there is a trace of Augustine in our First Amendment doctrine and theory. Remember, the First Amendment calls on us to have a robust public debate on the key issues of the day as part of our grand experiment, our exercise in self-government. That commitment to self-government requires us to do more than just not cause a riot. See, the law itself says we must stop the talk when it crosses a line, but I believe there's a spirit in the great document that is the Constitution that forcefully requires us to engage, and to engage in the spirit of St. Augustine. I believe we must come to the conversation with an open heart and an open mind. And only by approaching our difficult conversations this way, with the open heart and open mind, can we make progress. So if we only state our opinions and refuse to listen to others, we do not succeed in our secular national mission of self-government. But if we engage, we all move forward. So, how does this all tie in with the events in Charlottesville and beyond? Well, I think first we need to set standards and live by them. We must tolerate people with different ideas. You know, the earth isn't flat. I do believe that. But people have different ideas and we must tolerate them. Personally, I am not a white supremacist. Perhaps a surprise. But I'll let them say what they believe. And as sure as I am standing here, I am certain that my position will prevail and theirs will not. You know, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It may take time, but I'm convinced of my position that we will actually prevail on that. But what I saw in Virginia did not suggest that the protesters, for lack of a better term, or perhaps just Nazis and neo-nationalists, white supremacists, I do not believe they came with an open mind. I do not believe they came with an open heart. Instead, I saw open hostility to others. I saw torches. I saw a desire to fight, not a desire to learn, not a desire to share ideas. On that ground, I saw people who were determined to start a riot. And in the process, many were hurt, and one person lost her life to senseless, hateful violence. All good people should condemn that. I do not see blame on both sides. In addition, what I saw is, I think it's clear, if you're marching with Nazis saluting and chanting along the lines of Hitler's brigades, I think it's time to make a choice. I do not believe that good people march alongside that. As Senator Orrin Hatch said, we should call evil by its name. My brother didn't give his life fighting Hitler for Nazi ideas to go unchallenged here at home. In other words, we stand up for what we know to be right and against what we know to be wrong. So, and as we have seen, there's been plenty of criticism, bipartisan criticism of the president's reactions and statements in the wake of Charlottesville. And I'm not here as a partisan or a politician. And instead of talking about his failings, what I most want to leave you with is thinking about how we can use this moment in time as an opportunity for us to live up to the spirit of St. Augustine, the mission of Villanova University, and the core meaning of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. As a common law professor, I have a favorite part of the Constitution, which is kind of a funny thing, but that's what I do. I have a favorite part. The preamble says, we establish this Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. I just love those words. They're aspirational. We're trying to form a more perfect union. Not perfect, we're constantly striving. So I say, let us be true to that commitment by engaging in the hard conversations, with a commitment to making ours a better country through dialogue, engagement, and respectful disagreement. Let us all speak up and speak out. Let us come to our neighbors, classmates, teammates, colleagues, and friends with an open heart and an open mind. Let us love one another as sisters and brothers. Let the First Amendment be more than 45 words written on a page, and let Veritas Unitas Caritas be more than 3 words emblazoned on a seal. So those are my opening comments. I hope they're good food for thought.
I have pictures, so give me just a second. And I did test my equipment. Let's hope that it still works. Okay, so I'm not good with microphones. Can everybody hear me? Good? Okay. I want to start by obviously thanking Dr. Wall for her introduction and also my fellow panelists for being here with me and talking about these issues with us tonight. This is such an important and a complex issue in our country right now, and I really look forward to all of us sort of talking about it over the course of the evening. As Dr. Wall mentioned in her introduction, my research generally focuses on the rhetoric of social protest. But more recently, I've focused specifically on how people use protest or other modes of public communication to respond to hate speech. Since June of 2015, I have participated in various counter-protests, as Dr. Wall mentioned, in South Carolina. I hope that accent's not too bad. I mean, I'm Billie Jean, too, if that sort of helps. In South Carolina, in Pennsylvania, and in Georgia. So I've spent the better part of the past couple of years sort of facing down hate groups. And I feel like those experiences have prepared me to face down this new hate in alt-right clothing. So there's a meme for you. Do we get the meme? Some of you are looking like, I don't get the meme. You should Google it. It's good stuff. So when I started this project in 2015, 892 active hate groups were operating in the United States. But last year, that number rose to 917. Now, on the surface, that might not seem like that much of an increase. But when you consider that the number of anti-Muslim hate groups has increased by 197% in that 1 year, these numbers are really horrifying. Here in Pennsylvania, there are 40 of these freshly galvanized hate groups, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, skinheads, anti-LGBTQ groups, a Holocaust denial group, anti-Muslim groups, and more. Before the last election, whenever I talked to people about my work on hate speech, I inevitably spent time trying to convince them that these extremist groups were serious threats. Most people just sort of laughed it off, right? Those crazy extremists, just ignore them. Nobody listens to them, right? But now, with the mainstreaming of white supremacist ideologies through groups like the alt-right, and certainly after the horrible events in Charlottesville, most people would agree that we have to take these groups seriously and we should call them what they are, not the alt-right, but white supremacists. We can no longer dismiss them as crazy extremists. They have been mobilized and emboldened by our president, and their rhetoric won him the highest office in this country. But I don't want to spend all of my time telling you how bad this problem is. You all wouldn't be here if you didn't already realize that. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what my research and activism has proven to me time and again, that although hate clearly abounds, so does love. And with that in mind, I'd like to share a couple of stories that I hope will be helpful for you as you decide and make choices about what you're going to do or not about this issue. And you will all have to make that choice. We are already in that moment. Because with all of this media attention and the fact that the president has all but condoned these rallies, there will be more of them. In 2015, I attended a counter-protest of an openly pro-white march, their title, at Stone Mountain in Georgia. Neo-Nazis and Klan groups gathered with numerous Confederate flags, large banners reading diversity equals white genocide. And although, as Dean Alexander mentioned, constitutionally, Stone Mountain State Park had to grant a permit for their march. The officials, interestingly though, placed them in the most out-of-the-way parking lot down a one-way street and barricaded the entrance to all park-goers and counter-protesters. They were trying to hide the racists, right? But we wanted them in plain sight. We wanted to confront them. Historically, groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the ACLU have encouraged people to ignore these rallies and stay home, what they call a quarantine policy. But groups like Antifa, which you're hearing a lot about over the past couple weeks, and now other counter-protesters have rejected that policy in favor of one of confrontation. So after about an hour of trying to figure out where exactly the pro-white rally was, because Stone Mountain Park is enormous, we found them. We found the all too common lines of police officers in riot gear, armed with flash bombs and clubs and rubber bullets, lined up about 4 officers thick near the barricaded street access. But the counter-protesters were not to be denied their confrontation with the white supremacists. We hiked through the woods, and for those of you who know me, that is such a ridiculous statement that I hiked through the woods, but we did, in order to make sure that the racists knew that they were outnumbered and that they would have to face us. You're seeing examples of this all across the country right now, in California, in Middlebury, in Boston, and it's working. 67 rallies, similar to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, were canceled last week. It's almost like protests work. And I didn't even make that slide. That is from GQ magazine, finally saying it's like protests work. So it felt good, it felt good. So as a communications scholar, my profession is dedicated to fostering and promoting free and ethical speech. So the question always arises, and Dean Alexander certainly hinted at this, isn't it unethical to shut down their speech, right? To yell louder, to sort of get them to cancel their rallies, right? Is that unethical? Most free speech scholars tend to accept the idea that freedom for speech we hate is essential to preserving First Amendment rights for all of us. So the Supreme Court has put the onus on communities to meet hate speech with more speech, right? So these examples of counter-protests that we're seeing illuminate what more speech looks like in our contemporary moment. And what I've learned is that the importance of meeting hate speech head-on cannot be undersold. We have to be there with a physical and an embodied no. So much is possible when communities come together to stand against hate, when people use the communicative power of their bodies to form a line, to say no, not in our town, not at our university, not in our nation. But let me be clear, and I hope Dean Alexander will still be my friend after I say this. I am one of the few free speech scholars in my field that believes that these kinds of community responses are not enough. because I believe that the purpose of free speech is to contribute to democracy and to that marketplace of ideas that the dean talked about. I believe that hate speech should be a regulated and restricted form of speech, because I believe that hate speech is counterproductive to democratic processes, because it prevents minoritized people from participating in their democracy. That statement, that one sentence I just said, gets me trolled on the internet more than any other thing I have ever said, which is really saying something. But second, I also believe that communication constitutes the world that we live in, right? And Dean Alexander should have mentioned that as well, right? We create our worlds through communication. So what kind of world are we creating? What are we building when we provide a platform for speech that denigrates and calls for the genocide of an entire people? I don't want you to misunderstand that I've come to that viewpoint lightly. I used to definitely be on the other side of that fence. But I was in the throes of my early field work on this issue when the hate crime perpetrated against the parishioners at Emmanuel AME Church in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina happened. I grew up just outside of Charleston. I lived and went to college less than 3 blocks from Emmanuel AME. Being in Charleston after the shooting made it very difficult for me to figure out this line between free speech and hate speech. Dylan Roof exposed himself to so much hate speech online and convinced himself to commit this horrible crime as a result of that hate speech. The same is true of the man who ran down Heather Heyer. I struggled then, and I still struggle now with these issues. This is not easy. This is really complicated. But we need to seriously think about and talk about the price of protecting some speech in a context where guns are so easily accessible and white supremacy is condoned at the highest levels of government. We all have to reach our own conclusions about these issues, what we think is most democratic, what we think is most just, but we cannot ignore these issues. They affect every community, especially university communities like Villanova. So although it's true that I have seen amazing responses to hate speech in my fieldwork, I have been troubled by some things, which brings me to my last point for today. If we think these counter-protests are working in some ways, then how do we most effectively continue that work in spaces where free speech and hate speech collide? Traditionally, most of the counter-protesters at white supremacist events have been members of loosely affiliated Antifa groups. Sorry. But in recent months, I've seen more groups participating in counter-protests against white supremacists. Some people who have never stepped foot in a protest space before. And herein is where I see some troubling issues, as these people who have a great deal in common ideologically are confronted with conflicting tactics. Antifa members have traditionally focused on the police as part of the white supremacist problem. They see police everywhere as part of a fascist system. For example, they'll often chant things like cops and Klan go hand in hand. So you can see how Antifa's distrust of police and their perception of them as henchmen for a fascist system would get a sympathetic hearing from activists who were concerned about racially motivated violence, right, perpetrated against people of color. But tactically, Antifa protesters often bait police, right? They throw things at them, they set off bottle rockets, they engage in acts of symbolic violence, like setting a trash can on fire or something like that. They destroy property, right? They block access roads. This is known as an all-tactics approach, and Antifa activists often try to get arrested, right? That's a tactic that they use. But what's of concern to me is the inequitable burden that an all-tactics response poses for people of color in those spaces. When white activists, whether they are associated with Antifa or not, provoke violence from the police, they are certainly putting themselves at risk. And despite recent events, I have always seen more violence from police than protesters, but I think that context is changing right now. What I think is problematic is that when people of color are in the same space, they are at more risk. Not necessarily of getting arrested or even roughed up by police, but they are more at risk of death, of actually losing their lives due to an all-tactics approach. Because, as has been made apparent by the Black Lives Matter movement, people of color are more at risk of dying in any encounter with police, even the most mundane of traffic stops. Certainly their risk is multiplied in encounters where tensions among police and protesters are heightened. So as people who are concerned about the heightened attacks on minoritized populations in recent months, what we can really do to help is to make sure we are engaging in the all-important work of understanding what it means to be an ally in these protest spaces. We must cross lines of difference in smart ways, in ethical ways, in ways that fully interrogate the role of privilege. As the election has brought more and more people into the public sphere to protest on a host of issues, I believe that people from all races will be coming together to fight this increased hate we're seeing. People who may not have ever been to a protest, but more alarmingly, who have just come to the realization in the past 2 weeks that white supremacy and racially based hate is still a real problem in this country. People who have the best of intentions, but who may not understand that their bodies are not as much at risk because their whiteness protects them. This is not at all to discount the tragic death of Heather Heyer. We are clearly all at risk from these white supremacists in these spaces, but it's clear to me that people of color are more at risk, not just from the police, but from those white supremacists, right? And of the police looking away, right? And there's been all kinds of stories about the man who shot into the crowd and police did nothing. The beating of DeAndre Harris, where they're just now starting to sort of investigate more fully. So these issues are really complex. So my newly found goal in all of this is to explore not an all tactics approach, but what I'm calling an allied tactics approach. I'm looking to cross lines of difference and explore how those of us invested politically and theoretically in people getting into the streets and exercising those First Amendment rights can start or continue difficult conversations across those lines. These are conversations that must happen at each and every protest or counter-protest, especially as more diverse groups enter the protest space. As an example, at a protest in Philadelphia, white allies were asked to move to the back of the group during the march so that black protesters could lead the way. But at the counter-protest that I went to in Stone Mountain, white people were challenged to come up to the front of the line and stand with their black allies to experience the risk of being on the front lines. So what it means to be an ally in those spaces is fluid and contingent. And so we have to be willing to communicate about that in those spaces. And so my question to all of you as we talk tonight is, how can we ensure that more speech is also allied speech? What kind of tactics do we need to develop to not only fight hate, but build lasting alliances across those lines of difference? History teaches us that social justice initiatives and free expression thrive under threats of oppression. I really hope that our university community takes up these kinds of initiatives and puts them into action as allies.
So let me begin by echoing the two previous speakers' thanks, both to Barbara for organizing this and for all of you for coming. Because I think part of the question as we wrestle with these issues is to find spaces to have conversations, but also to try to find words and to come into conversations about them, even when we're not quite sure what to say. So I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm a historian, and I work on 20th century Germany, and so I'm not an expert on Charlottesville, and I'm not an expert on the First Amendment or about hate groups in the United States. So I guess on some level I'm going to be talking about Nazis and whether that should be part of our conversation. And there's been a lot of back and forth over the last couple weeks about whether Nazi is even the term that we should be using to talk about what's going on in Charlottesville or in the rest of the country. Do we need to be worried about Nazis coming to power in this country? And on one hand, I would probably say probably not. But I guess my starting point here is to note that it was the demonstrators on Friday evening in Charlottesville who quoted Nazi rhetoric and Nazi practice, right? They were the ones who were chanting blood and soil. They were the ones who were denouncing a Jewish enemy, proclaiming Jews will not replace us, right? They were the ones that were out with their torchlight marches. They were the ones that were out in their khakis and white shirts. And even that, right, somehow that's a kind of a cleaned up version of kind of Nazi attire, that they're not brown shirts. Well, in my research, going back to Berlin in the 1930s, it's really fascinating to read the Berlin police reports, and they have these ongoing discussions after the brown shirt had been banned for a while. The police are trying to assess, all right, well, now is that a Nazi uniform or not? If there's a group of young men wearing the same color brown pants, does that now constitute a certain membership in this organization? How do we decipher this? And so in a way, this comes much along this question of the situational context in which we try to decipher and interpret what it is that we're actually seeing. So what I want to try to do today is to think about the implications of these quotations that they are introducing into our political conversations. And this is where I think history and historical perspective can help us to frame these questions that we're struggling to figure out. So in an effort to try to help us frame that, I want to offer up 3 points as a way to think about these kinds of questions, as a way to think about who were the Nazis, perhaps how do we name them or how do we describe them, how did they act? And I think part of this now is that practices of Nazism, as opposed to just simply Nazi party membership or self-proclaimed status as Nazis, is part of what we need to think about. And then finally, how did they define their actions, or how they seek to explain them? And not just maybe what they believed, but in terms of thinking about the connection between ideas and their practices to try to work through those. So my 3 points. Number 1, it's not enough to denounce Nazis as monsters. And I think there's a way in which that's very comfortable, right? We can distance ourselves. Well, thank God I wasn't a German in the 1930s, right? Or that I wasn't a member of the SS, or that, thank God I'm not one of those neo-Nazis down in Charlottesville. But there's a way in which we can safely look at this from afar. And it's interesting, as the events in Charlottesville were happening, I was getting ready for the fall semester, and I'm teaching a course on Hitler and Nazi Germany. So I was working on my syllabus and the reading and planning that out. Unlike many history courses around the country, courses on Hitler and Nazi Germany seem to always fill up. And so part of me recognizes that there is a real desire to try to figure out what that meant and how these horrific actions could have happened in Germany, in Europe, in a time that wasn't that far removed. But if we don't want to have the study of Nazi history to be reduced to a kind of historical pornography, a kind of voyeurism in which we look back and proclaim our out of a sense of smug self-righteousness that they're not like us, I think we need to recognize that Nazism and Nazi crimes didn't depend just on a few 110%ers, right? The ones who really believed the ideology or were absolutely committed or were somehow some particularly monstrous characters. The question that history poses to us is how it was that so many ordinary, respectable, decent people found it reasonable and respectable to fight on behalf of a genocidal regime and to work with them to put genocidal policies into practice. Right? We know it wasn't just the SS, but also the regular army. Right? It wasn't just the people who were celebrating some sort of occult pseudo-religion, but it was Protestants and Catholics who also found it reasonable to join in these organizations and to participate in these crimes. It was also the people who were willing to buy goods from Jewish apartments or occupy those apartments after their inhabitants were forced into Jewish houses in the cities or forced to the east. So as we think about what it meant for Nazis to carry out the acts of this regime, we need to remember that it depended upon more than just Nazis. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the Nazi Party members tallied somewhere around 850,000 out of a population of around 80 million. Right? Certainly, they had not won a majority in the German parliament, but beginning in the summer of 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest party in the German parliament. So what we need to acknowledge the ways in which people who in many ways are disconcertingly like us, found it reasonable to participate in things that we might label as monstrous. Number 2, Nazis depended on normalizing practices of violence. So the point is not just about ideology, but I think the extent to which practices of violence were absolutely central to the ways in which Nazis operated. And this is also another way in which you can expand our sense of who was involved in this, right? The normalizing of extra-legal political violence in interwar Germany predated the rise of the Nazis. Already in 1918, the Social Democratic Party, right, the party that was most committed to democracy in the Weimar Republic, authorized right-wing paramilitary groups to try to prevent the success of a revolutionary assault on the German state. Most notoriously in supporting the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the two founders of the Communist Party, in January of 1918. This extra-legal violence set a dangerous precedent in which it became legitimate to try to defend the state, to defend the democratic order by means that were outside the reach of law. And so what I want to try to think about is even before Hitler's enabling law in 1933, there was a way in which taking recourse in a state of emergency or a crisis that was perceived as emerging out of an existential threat to German democracy, right? Terrorists assaulting the state, the society, threats from foreigners coming from outside the borders that needed to be confronted with resolute violence, that this is a language that appealed to a broad segment of the German population who were interested in defending an orderly society, were concerned about revolution, were concerned about foreign threats, were concerned about assaults on their way of life and their state. So these practices of violence became something that were the normal operating procedures for politics, and I think this is where we can think about this interplay between questions of speech and ideas and articulating them and the ways in which they are enacted and put into practice on people's bodies and in the streets. Point 3. Ultimately, Nazis seek to deny the humanity of other people. Right? So in terms of thinking about the practices of violence at the heart of the Nazi ideology, and this is an ideology that they also put into practice in terms of defending particular spaces, in terms of trying to occupy working class neighborhoods, in battling for the streets in cities like Berlin or Hamburg in the 1920s and 1930s. But it was also about denying those spaces as legitimately inhabitable by others, communists, socialists, Jews. By naming those as people who did not belong, they suggested that they were not fully part of German society. So here's maybe where I'll come back a little bit to the events of Charlottesville. So in the aftermath of Charlottesville, President Trump proclaimed that there were very fine people among those demonstrating with swastika flags and fascist salutes. The problem, from my perspective, is not his suggestion that Nazis are people too, because as you suggested, part of what I'm trying to explain here is the ways in which Nazism depended upon practices of violence by people who were just like us. Right? The problem is rather his failure to recognize that Nazis and white supremacists of all stripes seek to deny the humanity of others. But in this regard, perhaps we let ourselves off the hook too easily. Whom do we seek to exclude from our societies? Whose humanity do we deny? In the week before the events of Charlottesville, I was driving my daughter back and forth to camp in Westchester. And as I kind of avoided the main roads and would go through the back streets in Chester County, I passed a residual campaign sign from last fall's election. The lower portion of the sign expressed its support for State Representative Dwayne Milne. but most of the sign was taken up by the slogan, "Proudly supporting our police." 9 months after the campaign it promoted had ended in victory for its candidate, this sign has nothing to do with electoral politics. In Chester County, but not only there, it is clear that this society values police lives. Just as a small example, one of the lead stories on NPR as I was driving in was a celebration of the actions of Houston Police Sergeant Steve Perez, right, who died in his efforts working on behalf of the people of Houston. Right? So this is a very public expression, assertion of recognition on the part of the media, on the society that we live in. But in the context of national debates about violent police practices, this sort of blanket declaration of support for the police implicitly repudiates the assertion that Black lives matter. So this is now part of the ways in which it's about drawing lines, about imagining places that people don't belong, people don't fit. At best, this serves to tacitly reinforce the main lines, bastions of white privilege. At worst, it suggests that people of color enter our community at their own risk. That sign does not function as a signal of civic appreciation, but rather as a declaration of racial exclusion. While it may be a long way from exclusionary language to the kind of racist brutality we saw on display in Charlottesville, the first step on a path to unimaginable violence is a willingness to imagine that some people don't belong in our communities. And to wrap things up, I recognize very much the complicated lines of trying to draw equations between speech in 2017 and actions in Nazi Germany. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to suggest that that the homeowner who has a sign in the yard is somehow a closet Nazi. But what I am trying to think about is the ways in which speech and practices of violence become comfortable, become comprehensible, become imaginable, even as we also imagine that there are people who don't belong with us. Thank you.
Of the issues we're dealing with in this particular country. So since we are few enough, we had asked maybe if you'd write your questions. Why don't we just open it up for any questions you might have, and I you would direct it to the panelists that you have the question for? Yes.
I came here from Vietnam, served in the Navy, and I became involved in the moratorium committee. And the one lesson I took from that is that there is, in fact, strength and influence in numbers. I'll also say parenthetically that I got the motivation for a lot of these numbers wrong. Those protests, those marches, those demonstrations, they were anti-conscription. You know, I didn't get that until maybe 6 months ago. But I did get it. But the point is that if you're in opposition, if you're in disagreement, if you have an alternative idea or an alternative plan, you've got to show up. You've got to show up. What happens once you do is a different set of problems. But the key to the thing, the key to Nixon, to a certain extent to LBJ, was volume of bodies. They pay attention to that. These guys calculate. And it looks like numbers are stacking up against them. They'll change. Trump may be an exception. I don't think he calculates. I don't know what he's doing, but That's, in my view, is the thing you need to do. So, for what it's worth.
Anyone want to respond? Thank you. He's a Villanova alum, so it's, any other questions?
I was wondering, and I'll present this to all four of you, I was wondering if Villanova has had to deal with an open segment of white supremacists on campus. I would pray that that would not be the case in my alma mater, but people are, all kinds of ideas exist in all kinds of places. So I was wondering if Villanova, the Villanova community has had to deal with openly prejudicial and hostile elements.
Not open,
President Hill.
not openly, but hidden. So nobody has come out and identified themselves, but they've certainly have made their position felt.
How?
How?
Writing things on signs,
Cowardly.
yeah,
Yes.
posting things that are anonymous. But people have, and now whether they're Villanovans or not, I don't know. We don't know who they are, but there have been instances of that.
But we haven't had any groups who have asked permission to hold rallies or open meetings to promote.
Well, we had, yes,
that
we did have somebody last year that invited somebody to come here it was actually interesting that the group that the person was involved in actually was the ones that turned on him and said, no, we don't want the person here. So they kind of turned it around themselves, but they did extend an invitation to somebody.
Thank you.
Yes. Right.
I was just wondering, I don't know who to direct this to, but everybody's got all kinds of thoughts, economics or Trump or, why now? Is this surfacing? Is this always been here? And I know it's developing from what you said though, but why now? What's going on?
It's not just now, right? The actual spike in hate group activity in this country was during the Obama administration, because so many groups started sort of organizing in sort of racist ways and anti-Muslim ways because they believed them to be a Muslim. So that spike actually, we're up in the thousands at that point in terms of organized hate groups. And so it's not just now, it's just now you're seeing a lot more of it in terms of public, because I feel like, for me, the answer to that question is, they've been here and they've been doing their thing, and there are two things that have sort of led to them becoming more organized and more public, and one of those is the internet. It's a lot easier to organize on the internet. It's a lot easier for them to find community on the internet, and that sort of thing. And second, because of the election of Trump, they felt galvanized by that, whether that's an accurate perception or not. They believed that he spoke to their interests in ways that no other presidential candidate had. And so I think that emboldened them to be a lot more public than they have been. But I don't think that they're in any way.
I fully agree, and I think also the nature of the campaign, my former campaign person had, it was an appeal to emotion, right? It was an emotional campaign, and the reality is, frankly, that Barack Obama's campaigns were very much an appeal to emotion. And the less emotional candidates did not fare well in the last several elections. And the emotion here was definitely one that I think taps into exactly what we see, really Dr. Murray's research, and on the ground. And I'm sure it's not always on the ground and in the confines of Villanova, but it tapped into the emotion of a different set of people who wanted to express this emotion that we are seeing now. So it's I think an interesting confluence of several different events, but it's always been there.
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is I think that there's this question of things inside and outside the state and the ways in which they come together. Even if we look at, so speaking from a historical perspective, the rise of the Nazis depended also on the ways in which there were principles and practices that were also defended within the state. And so I think that this becomes a way in which, whether we talk about different kinds of state institutions, whether it's the military, whether it's the police, whether it's the judiciary, all these becomes institutional frameworks that also create spaces, different kinds of spaces in which this language can resonate. And so we can talk about media spaces and internet, but I think it's also about institutional spaces and structures of power and the extent to which they reinforce and create kind of an echo effect of this sort of speech and language that has been present in various ways for a long time.
Yeah.
Yes, what about the role of economics? I mean, we talked about the rise of Nazism usually associated with failure of the Weimar Republic. We obviously know that Trump really appealed to the people who are out of work, the people who are suffering from the Rust Belt, all of these things. You know, how does that phenomenon converge to what we are seeing now as open racism?
So I think there is a way in which there is kind of an experience of crisis, right? So post-2008, kind of this experience of economic crisis becomes part of it. In the same way that kind of the experience of economic crisis, although on a much greater scale, if we're talking about Germany from 1929, about 40% unemployment and that sort of thing. But I don't think that that's the whole story, because I think, and this becomes, I guess, gets back to this question about saying, well, it's a shame those kind of white working class guys in the center of the country are all voting for Trump, and thank God I live on the main line, and there's nobody out here that would ever have any ideas like that. And I think that that's part of it too. It's not just a question of there being kind of the economically disenfranchised, and for a variety of reasons, whether it because they could stand the Democrats in this country. I think there's also the same thing, and this was the story of the rise of Nazi Germany. It wasn't enough just for this to be this crisis that was producing a response. There were lots of people who were well within the establishment who also found this as a good opportunity to join in, found that they were part of
But
this.
did they profit from it?
Well, I'm not going to say that somehow that it was the capitalists who that the fascists are just the most extreme arm of the capitalists. That I would say, but I think that there was a lot of language that the Nazis were speaking that resonated with them. Part of it is in terms of anti-Semitism, right, and the ways in which that was one of the language. It was a language that people understood. That was not a new language that had to be introduced. And I think it's a similar sort of thing here. That kind of racism is not a language that people have to be taught in this country, right? I mean, this is a language with which people are already pretty familiar, and the extent to which they're willing to participate in it, that may perhaps be facilitated by a crisis, but I don't think that's the whole story.
It's who you blame for your economic anxiety, right? Not to say that those people aren't suffering from economic troubles, but it's who do you then scapegoat, right? So and I'm certainly not the expert, but from what I understand, right, the reason that you are suffering from economic ills in Germany at that time is because of the Jewish people, right? Like that's where you scapegoat all of that sort of anxiety. And for a lot of these people, it's Obama, right? It's the black people that are taking your jobs, or the immigrants that are taking your jobs, right? You scapegoat those groups for your very real economic anxiety, but then you have to put that blame somewhere because you don't want to put it on yourself, right? You don't want to say, well, maybe it's something I did, or maybe it's something that's wrong institutionally in our country. It's the immigrants' fault, it's the black people's fault, or whatever, right? So I think it's an easy trope for people to play on.
Bridget? Thanks, Bridget Dwyer. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you also for the organizers. This has been a fantastic panel. My question brings us back to Villanova, and I want to know what, from your different areas of expertise, you believe our responsibility is here at Villanova. And I'm going to couch it in a brief story. Last night I taught my first class, race, class, and gender, taught through peace and justice. And I had one student who did a summer program at University of Virginia, and I was not aware of this, but apparently there was a KKK march through the campus a couple of weeks before this event that had great media attention. That one did not have any media attention. This is a black woman from New York City who is scared, who is really, really scared. I had another white woman who said, I was committed to going to protest, I did it all spring, somebody died now, I'm not gonna do it anymore. My parents asked me not to go anymore. I have another student in that class who knew 5 people who were hit by that car. Our students are really affected by these things that are happening, specifically in Virginia, but also things that are happening in their own lives and the ways in which white supremacy is happening around us, right? You talked about it's happening on the main line. And I would venture to say that, I think it was Father Peter who responded, there hasn't been any sort of out in public things that are happening, but I think that what many of us are hearing in this room is not what every student is hearing. I think what students are hearing from other students is different than what some of the faculty and staff are experiencing, and some of the students who don't have minoritized identities are experiencing. So back to the original question is, what is our responsibility, and what do you, in your various areas of expertise, think that the call to action, or the call, what is the call in general to us here at Villanova? Thanks.
I'll just say, I don't know if this is my expertise, as a First Amendment guy, but I think as the dean,
right?
As the dean, and I've got my students right here, I see staff and faculty here, I think that they might, in a good way, say they're sick of me talking about values and the nature of our community and the obligation to speak up and to treat each other as brothers and sisters. And, I'm not going to stop doing that as the dean. And I believe with my boss over there, if I should even look over there, I think my boss, actually, I'll be very serious. I have extraordinary support from Father Peter, from the provost. That's I think my obligation, just to continue to encourage, again, my community, my group that I'm working with, students, faculty, staff, alumni, to say that this is our obligation to engage. And so I don't mean that necessarily, again, not necessarily as an expertise theory as a professor, but as a dean, that's what I can do, and I'll just keep doing it.
I think one thing, just talking about dealing with individual students, because when students find out what I do, I get a lot of students in my office for whatever reason. And so I think the first thing you have to acknowledge, right, that is a very real fear, that is a very real experience that they had. Students that have experienced microaggressions and racism and sexism and all that sort of on this campus and outside of this campus, that has to be acknowledged as a truth that they are experiencing that is very different from what I experience, right, as a white person. And then I think what it sounds like to me a lot of these students need is to feel like they are empowered in some way, right? That maybe they don't want to go to a protest or need to go to a protest, but what is something that you can sort of talk to them about what they can do so that they feel that they have agency again? Because I feel like a lot of these students feel like they're scared, right? They're scared, and that's that loss of empowerment, right? That they have no control over these things that are happening in their country, and so, or their community. And so what are the things that we can sort of talk with them about, okay, so what is something that they can do at a very small level, right? Or a larger level, right? Whatever they're comfortable doing that empowers them. And they have to feel like this community supports them from the highest levels to the sitting in your office hours, right? Like they have to feel like they are supported by their community to sort of be empowered to do something so that they don't feel that fear. So just like on that individual level.
And just to think about that, though, I think there's also ways in which we should be cognizant in which we, as an institution, also create contexts in which, perhaps in the narrative of protecting people from things they need to be afraid of, we also create structures that produce fear. I think the question about, for example, the arming of public safety is one of those examples in terms of thinking about how that is perceived by different students, and that becomes one of the places on a small scale in which experiences of fear and these threats are coded in particular ways. And I think that this question about what we need to be afraid of and where threats are coming from is something that we need to really wrestle with, because part of what white supremacists or Nazis have always depended upon is a declaration that we need to be afraid. Right? We need to be afraid of Jews or communists or terrorists or people with darker skin. And so how do we respond to that culture of fear? And I think that that's a way in which we also need to be attuned to how we institutionally are also involved in complicated layers of experiences and meanings that are hard to talk about.
Someone in the back has had their
Can I
hand
just
up.
add to that
Yes.
quickly? So Paul and I represent the Page Center for History and the Public Interest, which is a new center here on campus. And I think this question of what is our duty and responsibility has been on our minds a lot the last few weeks. In particular, I think it's shown for us that we don't always do a good job of talking about our past. We sometimes basically we cherry pick from the past and then we weaponize it in a way that will reinforce our current perspective or whatever ideological point we're trying to get across. And that does a disservice to our past. It also isn't really a service to the study of history. And so I hope that through a Page Center we can create spaces where we can have productive and useful dialogues about our past, even when our past is contentious and hard and brings up things that we may not like about ourselves. And since we're new, we also have a blank slate to create programming. And so if you're interested in fostering those types of conversations with us about difficult pasts, we'd be very interested in collaborating. So you can talk to Paul or myself in the days ahead. So just wanted to add that.
Yes, thank you. Yes. You have to let the law students.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much for your comments and for the discussion. I'm wondering, what are some of those powerful examples that you've seen of strong counter-narratives to build momentum towards positive change in society? Went from Nazi Germany to now we're in 70 years journey. It's changed significantly. And what are the roles of symbols in society? And this is kind of where the free speech comes into play as well. Right after I don't know how much stuff Dr. Steve you've done in post-Nazi Germany, but the banning of Nazi symbols in public. And whereas here in the United States following the Civil War, we did not have any sort of ban Confederate flags or Confederate monuments. In fact, Jefferson Davis dedicated the first statue of Roger Lee in 1883, went on to denounce citizenship in the United States, and these kind of pockets of the Confederacy continue to persist. And so what do you see as kind of, again, powerful examples of counter-narratives and the role of symbols in destabilizing?
This will be our last question.
That's a good one. You must be a law student.
Or a communication student. All we talk about is symbols.
I think that's actually not a question for your dean, it's a question for the others. But I think that the First Amendment, an interesting First Amendment aspect of this is when we talk about symbols, to the extent those are also expressive activity, that's then protected by the First Amendment. It goes, I think, to part of what Dr. Murray was talking to us about, what the effect of those symbols are, right? So that if somebody takes a Nazi flag and puts it in front of a home of a Jewish couple, then that has a particular impact. If a Confederate flag is placed on my lawn, that has a particular impact on me, which would be different than on you. So symbols have a particular power. And I think one of the challenges is, and part of this is a whole other dimension, which is going to be the book we'll write together. That's one chapter in this book is another dimension, which is about the impact that those symbols have on marginalizing people, and a tension, getting to our law school mode, between speech and equality. And I think that's something which is often lost in the law school legal dialogue, that speech is so extraordinarily important, but speech has significant impacts on inequality, and symbols do just that. So I think that's another dimension, which is, I think, again, seriously, if this were to become a book, that would be a whole other chapter that I see in terms of exploring the First Amendment versus the commitment of the Constitution to speech and the commitment to equality. And I think they come to tension very much so around that question.
like, I'm not digging on the law school, but if those are the questions you have, you should be in a master's program for communication. Just saying, because that's what we talk about, right? Like, language is symbolic, right? And those symbols matter, right? Those symbols matter. I mean, there's a reason that people are so upset about these statues coming down. There's a reason that those statues were put up in the first place, right? Because those things communicate a message about what does it mean to be a citizen in this country, right? Like, we memorialize all kinds of things, wars, particular historical figures, right? Lincoln Memorial, and then we have all of these sort of Confederate symbols, right? These Confederate monuments that people are getting all upset about being taken down, right? Because those symbols matter, because they teach us lessons, right? They teach us about who we're supposed to be, what our country stands for, what it means to be an American, all of those things. And so those are obviously very deeply emotional kinds of things, right? And so we have to sort of then say, in terms of the counter narrative, okay, well, what kind of country do we want to be? What is, if we're saying now that these Confederate memorials need to come down because that's not who we are anymore, right? People do believe that. Okay, then what do we put in its place, right? I mean, Martin Luther King has a memorial in Washington, D.C., but it's only been there for a few years, right? What does it say that, like, certain people are memorialized over others for certain events, right? And so those are kind of the questions about, this is our opportunity to create those counter narratives, right? If we're saying that is no longer a narrative that defines who we are, then we as a community have to sort of decide, okay, then what are we and what should we be sort of celebrating? What symbols do matter? What symbols do represent us and what we believe?
I actually think that's a really good point in terms of thinking about what do we interject. And this becomes a different way in terms of saying kind of more speech, more presence. Maybe one example I have. In Germany for the last few years, there's been a movement to introduce what has essentially become the largest public art installation in Europe. They're called these stumbling stones. And these are small brass cobblestones that are put in the sidewalks around not just in Germany, but and they would be a stone that would mark in front of the house somebody who lived there and was deported, and so it will say, you know, Hilde Meyerson lived in this house, deported to Theresienstadt, 1941, murdered Auschwitz. And these are things that you're walking along and you'll see it on the street. And I think what part of this is kind of it creates an interruption of your daily walking through the city in ways that aren't about big iconic spaces or memorializing, but about interrupting. And I think maybe that's what I would suggest, is that we need to do more interrupting of our normal discourse about saying, well, this is just the way things are. How can we recognize that there were Jewish people that lived here whose lives were erased by a Nazi state, right? And so it's not just about the Nazi state, but also about interjecting these vanished lives. I mean, in some ways, the Nazis succeeded, right? I mean, most of Europe's Jews are gone. And that, I mean, Poland there is hardly any Jewish population there, right? And so that in this sense, Europe is more ethnically homogenized than it was before the Second World War. And so this becomes a way of offering a counter-narrative, at least to that perspective of things, right? And so, you know, there are ways in which all this is now complicated in the current history, post-Second World War. I mean, that Europe this isn't the only story. But I think the ways in which we can create multiple conversations that we don't allow a single strand of thought to operate.
I think when Father Peter and I were in Würzburg with two other colleagues a few years ago, and our host took us one evening to the cathedral at Würzburg. As you walk in the cathedral, there is a menorah that is, I would say, at least 30 feet high. It's right as you walk into the cathedral. And so I asked our host, was there a Jewish population in Würzburg? Oh yes, there were some. I went on the internet that night and I found there was a large Jewish population that had been taken out. And so again, this huge menorah that you cannot miss, massive, in the cathedral it really made you question, as you said, it messed up your symbols, I think, in a good way. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, for being a contributor to this event, and by way of your questions, your presence, and your support, and also our panelists. Let's thank them